Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Hey everyone, this is the Fly Culture Podcast. My guest today is a widely travelled angler who first cast a fly in the 1960s in a trout stream in South Africa, and even then in saltwater too. He's lived in Germany and fished the alpine streams there before moving to the UK, where he's fished ever since. It's my great pleasure to welcome Clement Booth to the podcast. Clement, thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. How are you doing?
No, very well. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Pete. I'm doing well. I've just returned from a trip to Patagonia, so what could one have to complain about in the fly fishing sense?
Absolutely. And I know we were talking about setting this up for quite some time, and I excitedly told you I was heading there. And then I think it's probably, is it 6, 7, 8 journeys that you've had down there? And I know you headed somewhere a little bit different. Tell us a little bit about where you were and what you were doing.
Yeah, so the Patagonian side, I traveled to Estancia Laguna Verde, which is on the banks, well, not on the banks, but really close by Lake Strobel. And Lake Strobel is the famous rainbow trout water, and into that flows the Rio Barrancosa, which I think is one of the finest wild rainbow trout streams that I've ever fished. And I go down there most years towards the end of January, so the weather's fairly reliable, still windy, and I've done that 8 times since 2015, since I sort of semi-retired. And then what I also do occasionally is go to the north of Argentina and fish on the Paraná, the vast river, second only to the Amazon. And there we target golden dorado, although we catch other species as well. And I just come back from one of those trips in November, which was a cancelled trip that was due to take place 2 years earlier, but then came the pandemic. So, yeah, it's become a very important part of my fishing calendar one way or the other.
And there's nothing like getting out in the sunshine and down in Patagonia, the wind as well. Jurassic Lake, as you say, is incredibly well known with anglers. And, 8 years you've been travelling down there. Is it one of those sort of places that you'd sort of heard about or read about and thought, yeah, this is for me? What was the attraction of it for you? I know they're extraordinary size rainbow trout, extraordinary settings. What made you decide there over, say, because this time of year as well, and I love seeing people's trip photographs, but also people head to New Zealand, for example. Let's use that. What made you choose there instead of somewhere like New Zealand?
Well, I got to know about Lake Strobel from Peter Cotwell when he still had his store in Albury, and I used to pop in there and have a chat, and I travelled with him once or twice to other destinations, and by then he'd started going to Strobel, and Strobel was at that stage just opening up. From the point of view opening up, it means access, because it's a vast crater, and so to get to the lake is not uncomplicated, and tracks had to be built. So it was just starting to open up, and I thought, yeah, that'd be great. At the end of 2014, I gave up a sort of I semi-retired, gave up a 24/7 type job, and then I went along with Peter in 2015 in January, and I've been going back ever since. It's not like anything, any place that I've fished. It's not a lake, it's not a river, it's not the sea. It's a kind of a mixture of all those things. And the idea of being able to sight fish for rainbow trout that might be 15 or more pounds, even 20 pounds, to sight fish with dry flies, it's an extraordinary experience. Not only dry flies, of course, but we do get lots of big fish on dry flies. So it's just quite unlike anything that I do anywhere else. And I guess it's just become my personal challenge in a way, to go down there and to see if I can master some aspects of that environment.
That sounds really cool. And also, I guess, does it mean that you've been visiting there a while, that you approach it slightly differently? Because if I were going there and it were let's say a one-off trip, I'd probably say, right, I'd like to try and get a few fish under my belt to get a sense of what they're about and how to fish with them. But is it when you're down that you've done it a fair bit that you will, I don't know what the hatches are like or if they are free rising fish, but I guess in the conditions with wind and everything else, dry fly, and even, I guess, spotting it on the water may be a little bit of a challenge as well. But does that mean that you slip into a slightly more familiar form of fishing when you're down there?
Yeah, I think so. Over time, the tendency when people first go there is to chuck out big lures and strip them fast, and that really doesn't work. And as you get to know the lake, then you understand why. There are vast numbers of scuds, and the fish, for the most part, eat the scuds. These little shrimpy things, and if they're not eating scud, then they eat small snails called copperpots, or they take daphnia. That's really the three major food sources. There's no small fish in the lake. There's no, as far as we know, no leeches or anything like that. So the fish don't have to chase anything to find food, and so that's why stripping in a big lure is often not the best way to do it. So as you develop some understanding of how these fish feed and so on, so you reflect that in the tactics. And it's about slower retrieves. It's about smaller flies very often, even if the fish are deep down, smaller flies, small nymphs or scud patterns, or what is very successful is dry fly with a New Zealand rigged scud hanging behind it. That's an incredibly exciting way to fish. This dry fly sits on the surface and then it just disappears. And you think, well, what's happened? And there's a fish that's taken the dry fly. They don't splash it. They don't take it in a splashy way because there are no hatches for them to rise to. In that, even if there are, of course, sedges and other things around there, but with that wind, it's not much fun for a trout to chase that. And you don't need to when you're living in the kind of drive-by Starbucks of everlasting scuds. All you have to do is swim around with your mouth open.
Nice. And does that mean then, because as a stillwater angler, and I don't do a great deal of it, I'll be honest, but you mentioned daphnia, which I'm sure stillwater anglers and reservoir anglers will be aware of, and how the wind plays a part. Does that mean that you're thinking about, right, I'm fishing the bank where the wind's blowing into the bank, so you're casting into the wind, so you're thinking about those tactics. So they're kind of familiar from that point of view. And also, I'm imagining that although you're referring to it as a lake, that it's probably a massive expanse of water. Would that be correct?
It is. It's 10 miles long and 8 miles wide, and it's pretty deep. They think something like 60 meters in the middle. I don't know if that's been verified. The wind is always a challenge. And if you can fish the sandy banks close to where you're standing into the wind, in other words, you can get a fly into the water. They're very often fish right up close by, and it's a pretty challenging piece of water. I don't do any still water fishing really, other than at Strobel, and for me, it's a kind of a combination of these different elements that make it so attractive. But above all, it's really challenging. I mean, you need to be able to cast in the wind. It's not a given. And when I say wind, we fished there with winds up at gale force, and it's pretty challenging at times. But that's part of it.
Absolutely, and that sounds my sort of fishing. Anything that's a challenge, that's not a simple tap in, then I'm all over that, and I'm interested in it. And like you say, it's fascinating listening to you talk about it, that it seems as though the patience that you've probably developed over the fishing there over a long period of time shows itself and manifests itself in the fish that you're catching, because I've seen on your social media as well, but your approach as well, because I know that I would go down there, double haul as far as I possibly could into the background. And then, like you say, the fish are often in close. The fascinating thing for me, and I know I keep circling around the wind, but it really is a massive factor. And for me, I over the years, I'd seen many pictures and videos and films and TV programs of people fishing down there. And I've got to be honest that it put me off wanting to fish because of that. And I thought, God, this isn't going to be fun. You're going to be blasted. But actually, if you think about it, it's not quite as challenging as you think. And if you're prepared to think about, right, how am I going to present that fly, and how do I what's the easiest way of me getting my fly from A to B, then it's not that bad, actually, is it at all?
No, that's right. It's, I mean, when it gets really out of hand, then it can be brutal. And then you might have a day where you catch one or two fish and you believe that's the greatest triumph, because you've managed, despite the fact that the wind is blowing so hard that it's literally difficult to get a fly into the water. The more important factor than the wind is temperature. So if you get a windy day, but it's quite warm, say about 15 to 20 degree range, that's one thing. But if you get a windy day where it's 5 or 6 degrees, then be prepared to battle, because the fish will go down and you'll have to go and find them on the bottom. They'll be much harder to find. The guides are incredible at spotting the fish. Some years ago, I on the chalk streams, I sort of set myself the goal to spot fish better, because I felt that it was a side of my fly fishing that needed improvement, and I really focused on seeing fish and not casting until I'd seen them. Now, you don't do that at Strobel. You do cast blind, but at times, but looking for fish is something I do there as well. And at the beginning, the guides who can see these fish all the time, they'd say, yeah, they're on the right. Can you see it? I can see nothing. But now slowly over the years, I've started to also be able to see them. And it just makes it that much more fun. But also in terms of effort, your efforts are being used in a productive way, because you're casting when you see a fish as opposed to just casting.
That's a fascinating point. And I think the spotting of fish, I'm pretty okay at it, but I've got friends who are better at it. And it is just one of those things, isn't it? I think that I think sunglasses certainly, and I often say if people are going on a bonefish trip, buy some decent sunglasses. That will make life so much easier and pleasurable for you. But that ability to spot them, and we'll come on to chalk streams a little bit later, but absolutely, that's the essence for me of chalk stream fishing, that you want to spot the fish. Obviously, we look for a rise, but if you can see the fish, then you've got a better chance. But putting things into context for you, or for listeners, sorry, how big do these fish get in this lake? It sounds as though, there's abundance of food. I know, and I've seen the images, and I'm sure many people know what the answer is going to be, but they're pretty special trout, aren't they?
They are. So the records are around 27 pounds. And let's say anything over 15 pounds is a really big fish. There's a wild rainbow trout. And if you catch one of 20 pounds, you get your picture put up on the so-called Wall of Fame. Fishing's not competitive, but you still feel much better having your picture on the wall than not having it on the wall. And to all those who haven't yet got their picture on the wall, you say nice sort of platitude type things like, oh, well, it's all about the people and it's not the fish. And meanwhile, you're thinking, well, my picture's on the wall. That's great. So the fish, they grow at an incredibly fast rate. I'm not aware of any scientific studies, but what we've observed over the years is that there's several kind of cohorts of fish. You catch very few small fish, around the 1 pound mark. Very few of those. You get fish around the 3 to 5 pound mark. There's one cohort. Then you get 8 to 12 pound fish, and then you get the 15 plus fish. And I'm guessing that these fish don't live beyond 5-6 years, perhaps 7, the exceptional ones. And at that time, they will have reached their maximum size. And in length terms, that seems to be around 34, 35 inches that the fish reach. And in weight terms, just depends on their condition. The 20-pounder I caught was 33 inches and it weighed just over 20 pounds. It was in magnificent condition. Sometimes you get fish that elongate a little bit more, and you think, well, this is definitely a 20-pounder, but when you weigh it, it's not. It's not quite the condition. Other times you get a short, very fat fish that might be 24 inches but weigh 15 pounds, and which is extraordinary. It's like a football. And that's all to do with where they're living in the food chain, and also the impact of the spawning runs. So they, like steelhead, they run the Barrenkossa River and spawn and then come back, and a significant number of them die after that. But those that don't die regain condition and become these silver chromium colored fish after some weeks. So they are extraordinary fish, whichever way you measure them. From the point of view of the fish that fight the most, it's the 8 to 12 pounders. They're unbelievable. I mean, when you look at one of these, you think it's this is my next 20 pounder, but it turns out to be an 8 to 12 pounder, but just unbelievable, 40, 50, 60 yards of backing disappearing in a moment. It's fantastic.
Fantastic. That does sound absolutely wonderful. And what a lovely way to whet people's appetite for the season to come as well, talking about some special fish in a very special place too. And tell me, we're getting close. I know you're Chalkstream based, so I guess you've got to hang on till April for the time being. But for me, I'll be heading out 1st of March and casting a double-hander or a single-hander with pretty low water at the moment for salmon. Are you one of these people who does get, I think I probably know the answer to this, but are you one of these people who get extremely excited about the season that's about to unfold?
100%, yes. I mean, I always watch the weather and the rain and whether the aquifers are going to be filling up and so on. And then in the early part of the year, while I'm thinking about the coming trout season, I fish for pike on the Thames until middle of March when the season closes. And then you've got a couple of quietish weeks until 1st of April when we get back on the rivers. And I apart from watching the weather and what the water levels are going to be like, I also, having kept a journal for so long, I kind of review how the last season looked and try to introduce some new things every season. So as an example of that, I recognized when I started being able to spot fish better through focusing on looking for them as opposed to thinking of something else when I was in my business career. But I also saw that I spooked fish very often in spotting them. So I decided, okay, then the way to handle this is to lower my profile, to get into the water wherever possible. So on our Chalkstream beats, many of them are non-wading, but you're still allowed to get into the water at the edge, not walk up the river. And so I wear waders, I get into the water, I lower my profile, and in this way, just spook less fish. So each season I try to add another string to the bow, as it were. And I share that with a group of friends, and we kind of talk through tactics and what worked and what didn't work and so on. So I look forward to it enormously from the point of view of getting that first fish of the season. That will be great. But also in trying some new things. And I think you could do a lifetime of fishing on the chalk streams and you'd still only be scratching the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something pretty special, I have to say. But interesting, you talk about your journal there as well, and how detailed. I talk about them often on here, and how detailed do you make yours? Is it simply weather conditions, water conditions, what was hatching, or does it go deeper than there? Do you write thoughts about what happened on the day and what you'd noticed? It sounds like you may do, but I just would love some clarification of that.
It's evolved over the years. I started it in 1969 when I was 15 years old, and I had a certain style of writing in those days. And I would say in those early days, I probably didn't record as much in terms of weather conditions, water conditions. It was more about, did I catch a fish or didn't I catch a fish? Nowadays, I tend to record a bit more about the environment, about the people, perhaps some things that happened while I was there. And I'm on my sixth or seventh book, but it's still going, and it's a very useful reference actually, because it does strike a chord in your memory. And you're looking back, and particularly if you're going back to a place you haven't been to for years. I fished the Cape Rivers after I semi-retired in 2015. I went on the board of a company down in Cape Town as an NED, and so I was attending board meetings quite regularly. And I started to fish rivers that I hadn't fished for 30 years. And going through my journals, I was able to remember some of the tactics and so on, and it proved very useful.
Yeah, I guess I try really hard to keep one, and it's terrible. I guess we're lucky that we have things like Facebook or Instagram or whatever to remind us of things. And I know when I write something on my Facebook, I use that, I guess, as an outlet of some form to write something. And so I wonder if subconsciously that is some form of a journal in some way, shape or form. But you have nothing but my deepest admiration for doing one and sticking with it for so long. It must be fantastic to look through and look back and reminisce. And it brings us nicely around to where your fishing career began in South Africa and the streams that you fished there. And how did that start for you? And when did you know that fly fishing was something that was always going to be a part of your life?
Well, I was fishing for bass and also doing saltwater fishing before I started fly fishing in 1969. But I was a very keen fisherman. My father was a rock and surf man, and I went along with him occasionally. And then I had a cousin who used to do bass fishing, the largemouth bass from the US that were stocked in South Africa and became naturalized very quickly. So we went along and fished for those. And then in 1969, I saw a newspaper report about trout in our stream in the suburb where I lived. So this was walking distance from where I lived. So I went along to the Cape Piscatorial Society to ask about it, and was told, yes, there are trout in this river. They're stocked, and there's some natural fish as well. And all you need is a state license, which I had already. And I had to get my rudimentary fly fishing tackle together. And I went along and started fishing on that river. And on the very first trip, which I'd walked down, and I had basically just a handful of flies, and which I'd bought at that stage, and a level fly line and an Intrepid fly reel. I didn't have a fly rod. I couldn't afford one, so I repurposed a spinning rod into a fly rod, and I caught a 2.25 pound trout on my first day out, and that's what started me fly fishing, and never looked back since then. That's well over 50 years ago now. So
Wow.
It was a simple start, but I was fortunate enough to have that early success.
And do you think that was one of the things that sort of brought you into it? And I guess you couldn't wait to get back to the stream again. Do you think it may have played out differently if you hadn't caught that fish? Or do you think it's always meant to be? It was always written that, fly angling was going to be your thing?
It sort of felt like fly angling was my niche. My dad, as a rock and surf guy, I did that and caught quite a few fish with him over the years, but it didn't gel with me in the same way that fly fishing did. I mean, in those days, there was no one to teach you fly fishing. There were no guides or anything like that. So everything I did was as a result of self-teaching and casting and everything else. And it just seemed that this was my niche. So I started it, and it was always my preferred way to catch fish, and still is. I occasionally use spinning rods or bait casters on the Thames for pike if the conditions demand it, very high water or whatever. But I don't really fish much with anything other than a fly rod, and I haven't since 1969.
That's really cool. And one of the other cool things as well is that you took your fly rod into the salt as well. And, we sort of kind of feel that it's a relatively new innovation in our pastime, but people like yourself and many others were taking fly rods into saltwater situations a long, long time ago. I guess that's the world that we live in now, that it's easier to connect with people. It's easier to see what other people are doing. But then, people were just saying, well, let's give this a go. Was that how that happened for you, that you decided that the fly rod was more for you? And so you were going to go and do some sea fishing and thought you'd give it a go with a fly rod?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd caught fish with spinners and with bait. And it seemed to me, well, why couldn't you catch them on fly also? So a little bit of a heavier fly rod. And I had a good friend I still have down in Cape Town, Ronnie, and he and I decided we'd go and do some saltwater fly fishing. And at that stage, there was virtually no one doing saltwater fly fishing. We were one of maybe a tiny handful of people who attempted it. And the country is blessed with beautiful estuaries, and these lend themselves to fly fishing. And we caught some nice fish. We had plenty of blank days too, but that's the nature of saltwater fly fishing. And then I did a bit more over the years, but then when we moved to Germany at the end of 1998, that sort of ended my saltwater fly fishing for the time being, although we've now got a place out in Devon, and I'm hoping to recommence that at some point with the bass. So we'll see whether we get around to that.
That sounds really cool. And it fascinates me that, like you say, there was just a handful of people. And I love these little sort of edge of community groups that are looking at these things. And the development must have been because there probably wasn't that many heavier rods. There probably wasn't anything fly pattern wise. So were you just sort of developing and learning as you went along and tried to figure things out as best you possibly could?
Yeah, and reading a few books. Lefty Cray and others wrote books on Joe Brooks, and others wrote books early on. And so we had ideas on the flies, and we tied our own. And then there was a man down in east of Cape Town in Port Elizabeth who made rods, rock and surf rods, but he started to also make fly rods once it got going, and there were enough people wanting to try it out. So it was a sort of pioneering phase, I suppose, in a way. And I've applied that in other forms over the years. I think I must have caught 60 different species of fish on fly by now, and mostly the same logic. I think if it's swimming, it's probably going to take a fly in some form. So we just got to figure it out. And that figuring out part, for me, is a lot of the fun, to something that actually works.
Yeah, absolutely. And And what fish were you catching in the estuaries?
So we were catching what's called a skipjack, which is a long, slender fish, tarpon-like fish, and then others called garrick, which is down there called leervis, which means leatherfish. It's almost without scales. Those were the main targets, but there were others, shad and others in the estuaries that we caught. But one thing we learned is that, unlike the river where you said, well, in that pool, I know there's a fish there because I've seen it 3 times. In the sea, you had a whole different set of issues to manage. Barometric pressure, you started to take seriously for the first time. Wind, temperature, high tide, low tides. There was a lot of stuff to think about, and one had to develop some understanding of all that to have any chance of catching fish. But I think it's safe to say that in saltwater fly fishing, I've more often gone out and caught nothing than caught. But equally, when I did get something, it was incredibly memorable, all faithfully recorded in my diary. I've done a bit of deep sea as well in Mozambique. That was fun. It's again a different sort of saltwater fly fishing, and I've done some in recent years in Australia, in Sydney Harbour, because I used to travel there on business once a quarter, and so I started doing some fly fishing in Sydney Harbour from a boat, and that was great fun also.
Fantastic. And the challenges that you faced when you were sort of learning about the saltwater scene, that you were part of something that you were creating there, do you think that helped shape you to the trout angler that you are today, that it makes you deep dive so much more into what's happening and how it's happening and understanding that? Do you think that was forming while you were doing that?
I think so, and I think the one thing you learn to do in saltwater fly fishing is cast. And how does that play out on the chalk streams? Well, I often see people take guests and I watch how they fish, and they false cast 50 times before putting the fly down. And the one thing you learn in the salt when you're handling wind and all the rest is minimum effort for maximum result. And so I tell people on the chalk streams, look, don't fast cast at all. Just get yourself close enough to the fish that you can just do that, and then you've got a much better chance. And these are things that I won't say I learned in the saltwater, but it's certainly the notion of economy of effort became very clear to me, because you could wipe your arm out by fishing in an unintelligent way in the saltwater before lunch. Whereas if you used a little bit of nous to find out, well, where are the fish likely to be, and you can't spot them typically in the normal way, but occasionally you can, and many of those lessons are transferable to the rivercraft, which I practice today.
Absolutely. And
it's all about economy of effort. So people, I read adverts for the latest graphite rod where they say, well, Marlborough Man can cast 120 foot in howling gale in Montana with a number 20 fly and drop it down. And I'm saying on rivers, you never have to cast more than 30 foot, at the most 40, if you position yourself properly. So take the time to position yourself and then cast, and not the other way around. And I think economy of effort is probably the greatest single lesson, or put another way, slow down, do everything a lot slower, be a little bit more contemplative about it, as opposed to, well, I'm at the river now, so let's see how far I can cast. The fish are normally under your feet.
Yeah, that's music to my ears, and make it easy. That's the key thing. If you're listening, get yourself into a position where, as Clement says, where it's an easy cast. If it's an easy cast, there's less that can go wrong. You don't need to stand 100 feet away from the fish. Get as close as you can and learn about how close you can get to fish, because you may be surprised how close you can with careful wading if you're wading the river, or if you're thinking about how you're walking along the bank. Sometimes you can creep up on those fish and you don't need to crawl along face down. Yes, sometimes that can help, but you might be surprised. Then everything else becomes a little bit easier. You've got a shorter drift, so drag doesn't come into play. So there's all those sorts of things. And like Clement says, those very slight little angle changes, if there's a downstream wind or whatever. And I remember from the days when I was guiding that you'd see people physically tighten up if we got a downstream wind, and how their beautiful casts would change dramatically, and thinking those things through. And I often say, think about the cast you're about to make. I sort of kind of play it through. Do you find you do that to a degree, Clement, that you might be in a position, let's say it's on a chalk stream, and you might think, right, well, I've got to pop it here rather than just firing it out quickly. Do you think that process through a little bit?
100%. I mean, I think watching, seeing, taking in the environment is something which has gone up in my estimation, in my ability, enormously since I semi-retired at the end of 2014. As I was always busy before then. My mind was thinking of other things. I never saw, I very seldom, if ever, saw kingfishers before the end of 2014, but I would often hear them. And now I see them almost every time I go to the chalk streams. I see a kingfisher, and they were always there. What wasn't there was my mind. And I'm so one of the challenges I set myself years ago at the beginning of a chalk stream season was to catch fish on the near side bank, because I'd walk up, with my wellies on or waders, and you'd see fish scattering. And now I don't do that. I walk very slowly. I sit and watch. And this past season, I had a guest with me, and we walked up the river, and he'd gone a little bit ahead of me. And as I was walking up, I saw on the near side bank an enormous fish right tight into the near side bank. It was pretty much an impossible cast. So I did a bow and arrow cast, and it turned out to be an 8.5 pound brown trout. And I caught it, and it was right on the bank. And he's really a very proficient fly fisherman, but he was fishing the far bank. And the logic, of course, is that the far bank might have a few more fish because there's not people walking up and down it. But in principle, fish are sitting where the food lane is, and a lot of the food lanes are on the near side bank. So yes, I think being observant, taking the time, it enhances the experience a great deal, in my opinion. But it also is very productive. I think spotting a fish that was there all along that you might have walked past on another day is a very rewarding feeling.
Yeah, nothing like it. And yeah, that slow walk up the river, and whenever I get to fish a chalk stream, I slow down. But any form of fishing that I'm doing, I wait. The river always gives you a bit of a clue. So I wait for that clue and then see if I can take advantage of it. It doesn't always work out the way that I hope it will, but I try my utmost to try and do that. So life took you away from South Africa and on to Germany. And I guess it was a different sort of environment you were fishing. These alpine streams that you talked about at the very beginning, were they a different challenge that you'd been facing from the streams that you'd been fishing previously?
Oh, they were hugely different, because when we moved to Germany, I'd been fishing the UK chalk streams for years already on business trips. And so I kind of knew how to fish upstream, slow moving rivers where there's very little gradient. And then suddenly I was into these German streams which were running down the side of mountains, and your typical upstream tactic was completely useless, because you would cast and the fly would be behind you before you were even ready. So I learned a whole bunch of new tactics in Germany, not the least of which was downstream dry fly fishing, which could translate itself into kind of tenkara type thinking. I occasionally fish tenkara, and it's a fascinating way to fish because you essentially fishing a dry fly drag free by just dapping it on the surface of the stream, and these Bavarian and Austrian anglers, they do this very proficiently, and of course they also fish very heavy nymphs. I'm not so keen on that method, but it's highly effective. Just rolling a nymph or two upstream with a long rod. One had to do that as well on those German rivers to catch fish in some parts. But there were also parts of the river, my home river, particularly where the gradients slowed, and there were pools, and then you'd get patches, and you could fish them the same way as the English rivers. So it was a question really of adapting the tactics to the circumstances, and not being trapped in some kind of dogma, which you often find in this neck of the woods. There's lots of dogma around here. People have attached very often a kind of a value system to upstream dry fly fishing. And really, if one reads the history of that, it's because the chalk streams lend themselves to upstream dry fly fishing because it's the easiest way to catch the trout in a slow-moving river. And it's visually exciting and a lot of fun. It's nothing to do with it being a superior form of fishing, although there are those who suggest that it is. I'm not one of them. I think it's the right tactics for the circumstances. The alpine streams were a big wake-up call in terms of the need to adapt tactics. But now those tactics where you're allowed to apply them, a lot of our rivers are actually upstream dry fly only. But for example, on the Devonshire Avon, which I fish from time to time because it's near where our place is, you can apply many of the German tactics on that little river to great effect. I learned a lot there. It's a totally different experience because you've got to do an exam before you're allowed to go fishing at all. And I've got the German state license, which is for lifetime, and I can fish there anytime I want to, provided I've got access via a club or as a guest.
So how did you find that in comparison? You said that you were fishing chalk streams and you were fishing there. Was that a nice juxtaposition, those two forms of fishing that you were doing? Or were you finding that you were being drawn more and more to chalk streams, or you were enjoying both for exactly what they were?
Yeah, I think both for what they were. So the chalk streams for me it's a kind of experience. There's quite a debate underway and has been for years about whether the chalk streams should be stocked or left to become natural. And the truth is that most of the chalk streams weren't natural in the first place. They largely man-created, and even in the Victorian era, they were stocked. So I have no problem with stocked versus wild fish. Some of the upper reaches of the chalk streams don't need to be stocked and shouldn't be stocked because they sustain wild populations of fish. And then as you get into the middle sections, the rivers are less viable for wild fish, and so supplementary stocking makes sense. And it's the same principle in Germany. The majority of fish that you catch in the upper reaches of the river are natural fish, and then as you get into the lower reaches closer to where people live, you might find that there's some stocking as well. And I simply play the ball that's bowled. If I see a fish rising, I don't say to myself, "Oh well, hold on, that's a stockfish. I'm not going to cast for it." I just try and figure out what it's eating, and then and try and catch it. I would say for me, the chalk stream experience is the complete fishing experience. I probably enjoy it even more than any other form of fishing as a sort of day-to-day thing to do, and that's about the people, the places, the uniqueness of the the English chalk stream. I think there's many aspects which make them unique and a great pleasure. But the alpine streams, again, it's a different set of challenges and no less rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move away from Germany, what were the species? Were there grayling? Were there brook trout, brown, rainbows? What were you fishing for in those rivers?
Rainbows, grayling, and brown trout. That's what I caught in the rivers there. I didn't ever get into fishing for hoeken, but it's still something to do. That sort of Danube salmon, and that's very much a January, February affair to catch those. That's a very hardy bunch of specialized fishermen in Germany, fishers in Germany who go after those. I didn't get around to doing that, but again, that's something I'd like to do. I very much enjoyed the trout and the grayling and the brook trout and so on. In that, I went to Germany for a year as a very young man, but I didn't fish in that year over there. But the second time I was there for 5 years, and I was just starting to get into the fishing scene when we decided to move to the UK. I would say there's every possible fly fishing experience in Germany, particularly in Bavaria, where you've got these wonderful mountain streams. It's just fabulous, actually. Just a change of pace, something different. I still like to do it.
It does sound amazing, and having fished Italy for the first time last year, I'm guessing it's kind of similar. And I absolutely, I felt like I was home in some respects, because some of it is a more bigger version of perhaps some of the water I might encounter on Dartmoor as well. So I kind of like that. I love fishing pocket water, be it in the US or on Dartmoor as well. So I kind of liked it from that point of view as well. So yes, it sounds deeply interesting to me. Passing any form of exam, I've got absolutely no chance of that though. So my license will probably never come along. But work, I guess, took you to the UK. Was it always going to be in chalk stream country that you landed? Because you said that you were fishing there previously. Was it just non-negotiable that you were going to be close to the chalk streams on that basis?
I had to be, when we moved to the UK, I had to be close to schools, and I had to be close to Heathrow. So we ended up in Surrey and ticked those boxes, and now we're in Berkshire and still ticks those boxes. So I think we're very lucky that from my house I can be fishing one of the rivers that I have access to within an hour, and that's a huge privilege. In many places, you might drive 2 or 3 or 4 hours to get to the rivers. So it just came together, I suppose. But the priority, of course, is I needed to be close to Heathrow, because I was flying somewhere every week, and it didn't make sense to drive a couple of hours to get to Heathrow.
No, absolutely. Very, very lucky to be so close. And having spoken to you for a little bit now, that I'm getting a sense of you as a person and as an angler. And it strikes me that you're incredibly observant. And in the time that you've been fishing the chalk streams, what have you noticed over the years? Has much changed? Has a lot changed? Has not much changed? What have you noticed in that period of time that you've been fishing them?
Well, there's not a lot that's changed for the better. The hatches have declined, that's for sure. So if you use the windscreen measurement, how many bugs are stuck on your windscreen by the time you get to the fishing, there's less now than there were. And we have the tools and the understanding of how to reverse that. Will we do that? I don't know, but I hope that over time we'll do some of the things that are necessary to allow the hatches to regenerate. That said, we still get good hatches, but it's not like it was. I would say by far the most important factor has been water abstraction, and then right behind that, pollution. But I think water abstraction has even been more severe in the sense that a certain amount of pollution happens where you have people, but at least if your rivers are flowing at a decent level, it sort of sorts itself out. So I think the chalk streams have been in the first time I fished a chalk stream was around 1990. So in between then and now, I would say they've come under significant pressure. We still have great fishing, and the moves to restore rivers to a more natural state is well underway and is yielding very positive results with good recruitment of wild fish, wild trout and grayling taking place. But I think we should be under no illusions that if you take out 75% of the flow of a river, that it will have consequences, and it is having consequences. If you then introduce pesticides, nitrates, water companies that should never have been privatized on the basis that they were in the first place, that they with impunity pollute the rivers, particularly the lower reaches. When I say with impunity, they pay the fine because the fine is less than it would cost to not pollute them in the first place. I think we should be under no illusions that the chalk streams, as we've known them in our lifetime, if we want to pass those on to the next few generations, some actions are actually needed. Otherwise, I fear some streams might even be lost.
Yeah, it's a great worry for us. Yeah. And the abstraction thing reminds me greatly of some car stickers that were going around quite some time ago now. It must have been early 2000s. And I know my friend Luke Kozak and I think Malcolm Anderson and some other people as well had them on their cars. And it said, Wessex Water sucking life out of the river since the 90s. And that summed it up perfectly about abstraction. We've known about these things. Do you sense the voice is getting louder, but is it loud enough to make change?
I think so. I mean, I'm a trustee of what is now called wild fish. It was salmon and trout before, and salmon and trout conservation before. And I think the ability to highlight the points is there. The difficulty is trying to figure out what, if any, vision the government has for the environment. In the days of the European Union, there was a framework of how our natural resources were to be managed. I'm not saying it's the only framework, but it's quite an effective one. It's by and large, rivers in Austria and Germany and Italy, they're clean and not in bad shape, although they suffer from all the same issues that we do. But now, no longer being part of that framework, it has to be replaced by something new. And it's not completely clear yet how that vision for the environment might unfold. But we certainly hope that they'll take more account of perhaps even enforcing their own laws would be nice. The water companies are subject to laws and very often are just let off their responsibilities or granted permits for additional water abstraction. I fully understand that you need to give people water to drink, but it would also be helpful to build some more reservoirs and to develop more regional and national water grids. Why do we need to have these emails coming through our inboxes almost every summer saying, please save water because we're about to have another drought? It's nonsense. We don't ever need to have water restrictions in this country if we manage the resource properly. So I think what's missing is a vision for what we'd like the country to look like, and that includes the environment.
Some great points there. And to stop me ranting, we're going to move on a little bit more. But great points. Wild fish, absolutely. And if you've listened to the podcast I did with Nick Measham, please do if you haven't already. That will tell you about what wild fish are up to, and it's incredibly important. So I hope you'll listen to that if you haven't already. We share a love for cane or bamboo rods. How would you sell, and I call them, I tell you, I was going to ask you the question, cane or bamboo. How do you refer to them?
Well, both really. So split cane or bamboo, depending on which side of the Atlantic I'm on and who I'm talking to, but interchangeably. I think they're the resurgence of split cane makers around the world, after having sort of reduced in numbers dramatically in the 1970s, 1980s, 60s, 70s, 80s, mostly because the American makers found it very difficult to get the bamboo during the embargo years of in China, and then the resurgence in the 80s has been something amazing to see. There's not that many people around the world who actually make a living making split cane rods, but there are a lot of people actually making them now.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see that growth that I've talked about many times on here. And, I think I'd probably call it bamboo simply because, and I think people may think it's, people feel it's a superior or elitist way of fishing. It's not, because I do it for starters. So that's why I kind of refer it to that. But that's why I just enjoy having something almost organic in my hand that I'm casting. A friend of mine builds them, so I kind of like fishing them as well. And I've always enjoyed it from the 90s. I think in the 90s I was fishing it. I was absolutely. I had a Sharps, and then was fishing the Wiley with bamboo back then as well, and have continued to on and off to the degree that I'm enjoying it even more so. How would you, though, sell fishing bamboo to a bamboo skeptic, or somebody says, well, they're expensive or they're elitist or whatever? How would you sell it to somebody?
Well, if I use the chalk streams as an example, you never need to cast more than 50 feet, and more likely 30 to 40 feet. And if you do, then you're standing in the wrong place. So you need to get a little closer. So that's the first thing. Bamboo is all about accuracy and delicacy. It's not as such the right material for distance casting. But for me, the biggest single advantage of bamboo is that it eliminates the false cast. The false cast is now no longer necessary. I strip out. I look at the fish that's rising on the other side of the Avon. It's 25 feet away. I strip out a bit of line and I just put the fly where the fish is rising. And with a graphite rod, which doesn't load under its own weight, it needs the line to load it. It's an altogether different approach. So the fact that a split cane rod or a bamboo rod loads under its own weight with no line out gives you a significant advantage for most of our river environments. And I don't fish anything other than split cane rods on our rivers any longer. I had lots of high end graphite rods, and I sold them all. I don't have any. I've got some for the heavier stuff, for 8 weights and so on. But no, when I'm most often on the rivers, it'll be with a 3, 4, 5 weight bamboo rod. I don't need any more than that. It's I think there is a school of thought that says they're heavy, and it's true that they're heavier than graphite. The piece of solid shaft of a split cane rod, hexagonally made, or even a quad, it would be heavier than an equivalent tube of graphite. There's no doubt about that. but I can recall a discussion many years ago, around 2007, with a great American maker who's no longer with us, George Maurer, and I'd contacted him because I wanted to buy a 7.5 foot 5 weight, quite fast action American split cane rod. And so I got onto George and I talked to him on the phone, and I said to him, George, okay, this is what you're going to make me, and I'm happy with that, but what will it weigh? And he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, I don't know, but if you can't pick it up, you're in trouble. So that was the end of that discussion. And weeks later, when he was finishing the rod, he said, by the way, I weighed it, and it was 3.25 ounces, and I've still got it. I got it in 2007. He had part finished it already. So the weight is a nonsense argument, really, because the difference between 3.25 ounce, 7.5 foot 5 weight, and a graphite equivalent, which might be 2.25 ounces, is not significant. The feel is different. A cane rod feels like it's got more weight high up, and a graphite rod feels like it's got more weight low down. So the distribution is different, and that manifests itself in how they cast. Split cane rods loading under their own weight, and graphite rods needing a bit of line out in order to do that. So I think it's, in short, I would say that for chalk streams, it's the more efficient material to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And even our streams as well. I fish, and it's got me thinking what you were saying about the lack of casting, so it's less tiring if you felt weight was an issue, but also it may well be a function that I was fishing, and I was thinking of the podcast I recorded recently with Toby, and we fished some bamboo there with a nymph in Tiverton for some grayling, and it was absolutely fine. The rod came alive with a dry fly, but I said to him that, very often in Devon you're fishing the water rather than to the fish, whereas where I'm fishing a lot of time now in Devon, I'm fishing to the fish, and so I'm not making as many casts. So I don't know if that's got something to do with it, why I'm fishing a whole lot more, because I'm fishing in a different way. And I've got to be honest, and I said on that podcast, I was a bit rusty of fishing for the water, not in the way that I did it, but the way I called the changes, because I just don't do it so much now. And I kind of like finding the fish, as you've said, be it on a nymph or if they're rising, and wait for that rise. So I'm probably only going to make 2 casts or something, and that's it. And I may hook a fish, I may not. So I'm not doing so much. So weight doesn't become an issue from that point of view. But it's been a revelation for me over a long period of time, and almost a culmination that now, it's hard for me to look beyond that. There's some tapers. My friend Luke does a fast one, but he's got a new taper that isn't quite as fast, which is beautiful to fish with. It's a 3-piece rod, so I can take it abroad. And I love fishing it, and I think it's cool. That's why I do it. I just think it's a little bit different, and I think it's fun from that point of view. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, Clement, as well, that you said, the bamboo, that for you, that you'll fish exclusively not exclusively, but you fish on your home waters around those chalk streams. But does that mean that will you pack it in the car and fish around the UK? Are there places that you like to go fish around the UK?
Yeah, I haven't travelled as much as I should have, but now that we've got a place in Devon, I'm starting to introduce that into the artillery. I've done some fishing in Ireland, salmon fishing on the River Moy, and so yes, I'm going to probably be doing more and more local fishing. I recognise that eventually I'm not going to be traveling to the other side of the world to fish, and I'm going to explore more and more here. But I also recognise that I'm only scratching the surface. I fish the Thames a lot, and I think you could fish a whole lifetime just on the Thames, and you wouldn't do anything other than scratching the surface. So my travelling, I guess the Derbyshire Wye, that's going to be on the agenda sooner rather than later. That looks like my sort of river. and I'd like to give that a try quite soon. And yeah, in my cane rods are going to come with me. If I fish for grayling in middle of the winter and it's necessary to fish some heavy nymphs, then I use a 10-foot graphite 3-weight rod because that's just easier to handle. But other than that, it's the cane rods pretty much all the time.
Nice. No complaint from me about that. I wanted to ask you, you said something earlier about it's the people and it's the places. How does that translate to you as an angler? Does that mean you enjoy spending a day fishing with someone, or do you like to fish alone, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I love fishing with other people, but there are also days when I need to fish on my own. It's just the way it sometimes is. So if I've had a particularly busy business period, and that happens still now, then when I go out, I very often like to go on my own and potter up the river, literally potter. I might only cover 400 or 500 yards of river in the whole day. But there's other times when I fish with good friends that I've known for years, and we may fish leapfrogging each other up the river. And I only do that with people that I really know well, because that's not a good way to make friends if it's not handled the right way. Or we may say, well, you take that bit, I take that bit, and we meet up at lunchtime, and that model works well as well. Or I might, with good friends, say, let's go and do a dawn raid on a Saturday morning, and we get down to the Loddon or the Anton at 6 in the morning, and we're home at 11. And each of these represents a somewhat different experience. When I'm getting into when I've been in a work mode and my mind is kind of racing, then the ability to go on my own for a few hours is absolutely necessary to slow everything down again, to get life back to normal. But there are other times when chatting to someone whilst walking up the river and doing the leapfrog maneuver is hugely rewarding, not least because particularly if it's somebody who's fairly new to the rivers and I'm familiar, I might be able to spot a fish or two for the friend, and that's rewarding to put somebody on a fish as well. So it really depends. It really depends on what I'm needing from the river on that particular day.
Great answer. Anywhere you would love to cast a fly that you haven't?
I probably like to catch some brown trout in Iceland. I haven't been to Iceland, and I would probably like to do that. And then I'd like to fish in Slovenia at some point as well.
Nice choices. It's funny, Iceland is becoming a popular spot for trout anglers, where it was historically well known for salmon and sea trout. There's definitely been a swing the last 3-4 years, hasn't there, of more people travelling to Iceland to go hunt down those great big brown trout. And you don't have to, they're getting on for New Zealand size and some more probably, or up there anyway, at least. And you don't have the jet lag and everything else to contend with either, do you?
That's exactly right. I mean, I'm not a destination fisherman, so I'm not trying to add new places with new big fish. I like to go back to the same places, and that's why I keep on going back in Argentina to the same places, because it's really about the people as much as the fish and the whole experience. But that said, I would like to catch a hook one of these days. So that will be a early part of the year. Slovenia is probably the best chance. Maybe Bavaria, but Slovenia is probably better. And yes, nothing wrong with some of those magnificent trout on the Icelandic rivers. The problem is that as soon as the stuff becomes quite popular, then it takes on a different character. I think the prices go up, it becomes a more competitive type thing, and that doesn't always appeal to me. So I'm quite happy if I never get to fish any new rivers at all, and just have to fish the ones that I've got. Then I'm quite happy with that. Actually, I don't need to have any new fly fishing experience in order to have had a full fly fishing life.
I think that's wonderful. And I think I'm coming round to that too, that what we have, we enjoy, we cherish, and every minute there, be it fish field, be it not fish field, is wonderful, isn't it? And that's why I think I love the little stream I fish so much that I rarely get past it, because I spend most of my time there. And it's a lovely way to look at it, isn't it? And to enjoy what's exactly on your doorstep.
Yeah, exactly. My good friend and wonderful rod maker, Edward Barder, he says he thinks that we've got the best fishing in the world here in England. And whether you think that or you don't think that, it's not without substance. If I can get in my car at 6 a.m. and an hour and a half later be fishing with a dry fly on a crystal clear chalk stream to wild brownies, well, I mean, what more could you possibly ask for? And in Devon, the river that I fish is 20 minutes from our place, and what more could you possibly ask for? It becomes then a different sort of experience. It's not like a trip or an excursion. It's just going to visit an old friend for a few hours and perhaps catch a fish or two and go home.
That's beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. I think that's a wonderful place to finish our conversation. We've spoken for over an hour now, Clement, and we've covered so much ground. I think there's lots more that we could have covered, but it has been wonderful to learn about your fly fishing history, what it means to you, how you fish. And I really think listeners will enjoy hearing about it as well. So I'd like to say a massive thank you for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thanks a ton. It's been so much fun to meet you over the system, so to speak, and tight lines. Tomorrow I'm going down to the Thames and trying to catch a pike. We'll see whether we can do that.
Fantastic. I wish you the very best of luck with that. Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this. As ever, there will never be any charge for these. They're completely free to download. I hope if you're enjoying them that you'll consider giving us a rating and perhaps a few words. It helps us connect communities, and that's been very important to me via Fly Culture, to connect anglers together with each other. And if we're able to do that, I think the world's going to be a better place. So thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.